Good afternoon. Great to see everybody on this beautiful day. It's a little chilly, but you know, the weather permitting, we'll be in great shape. We don't see snow or rain in the near forecast, so all is good. And what a great day to launch the new President Speaker Series, both to those in the crowd here today and then those online as we're live streaming the event as well. And the goal of each of these events every time is to bring the best of the best to Missouri Valley College. We want to challenge minds, engage our academic community, and welcome thought leaders to the campus. I wanted to start off with a topic of great interest to everybody. I know nobody's talking about artificial intelligence nowadays across the globe, not just in higher education, but in businesses alike. This is a topic of everyday conversation. So it just so happens that I know an expert in this field. I worked with Dr. James Hutson in one of my previous lives at Lindenwood University. Let me just say, he's one of the smartest, hardest working individuals I think I've just about ever met. We both share an affinity for energy drinks, to say the least. Dr. Hutson has a bachelor's degree, 2 master's degrees, and 2 PhDs. He's held various pedagogical and administrative positions across 5 universities. His scholarly portfolio includes several books on the application of artificial intelligence in education and cultural heritage. I'm so glad Dr. Hutson accepted the offer to speak. His take on the impact of generative AI in the liberal arts education is mind-blowing, to say the least. I am confident that AI is going to make us much more intentional in terms of how we teach. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my colleague and friend, Dr. James Hutson.
All right, thank you so much. Hopefully we can give you some actionable things here today. Again, thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Parisi. Luckily, one of the PhDs is in artificial intelligence, so hopefully I can teach you something relevant here. Can we turn on the slideshow? Here we go. As we're getting set up here, I thought I would kind of give you an overview of how we'll approach it. So we'll start by kind of setting up where we're at now and where we're going to be with learner demographics over the next 5 years. Not, of course, to be negative or scary, but just to show you how AI is going to assist us in many ways and allow us to get back to what we really like to do, which is, of course, teaching and getting to know students, mentoring, and the really grassroots part of teaching and liberal arts education. So I just wanted to kind of foreground things. I do have, a dog in the race, so to speak, in that I have 2 children that were, once again, born and lived through the pandemic. So this is completely normal to them to go to school with masks on. And we need to think about them coming up next after Gen Z, which is what we're looking at now, right, in our classrooms. Now, Gen Z, this is the good news, is we have some time. So we have, as talking with many institutions, especially large state schools, R1s, et cetera, many of them put a 2-year pause or kind of moratorium to see what will happen with AI. And so they want to see what others, such as you and my institution and those that are seeing how this is actually going to unfold in the classroom, are doing it and then see what they need to adjust to. So the current generation, Gen Z, we found out through a nationwide study of 5,000 K through 12 educators, they're actually very positive when it comes to integrating AI. From K through 5, they like using it in terms of helping them with their own paperwork, administrative duties, et cetera. And then from 6th grade on, showing students how to use it. However, the students that we have went to high school or had the secondary education before generative AI hit. And so they're still behaving in that hidden curriculum. And I assure you that there is not wide-scale, rampant cheating in this way. They're incredibly paranoid. Most of the students are good students about being accused of plagiarism. I was actually just talking to Dr. Parisi and also Brooke a moment ago. We even have, colleagues that are getting doctorates at other institutions that are getting improperly flagged for using it because of Grammarly and other things. So we'll talk about that. But I just wanted to show you this generation coming up. If you think back, and I was at a retention retreat, and I remember when I was in college, I would go for a registration day at a preset time. They would hand me a schedule, and then I would leave, right? And then I would go to class. I would be there with the instructor with a printed syllabus and a textbook, and then I'd leave. And that's the whole of the interaction that I'd have with them until I saw them next class. That is entirely different as far as the expectations of this next generation. So the next generation's expectations, and again, this is also not really fair for all of us as educators because we weren't trained in this way. We weren't brought up and went through our doctoral studies and or teaching assistantships to teach in this way. And we just went through a global pandemic. So we are really racing and trying to catch our breath here to figure out what's going on. But what I want to point out as far as this next generation coming up, like my son and my daughter's generation, is that my generation was slated to have 3 major career changes in my lifetime, Gen X, right? So having to retool and do something radically different. Their generation, according to many studies, will do that 10 times, right, in this way. So we need to think about long-term equipping them with the skills they will need to learn these new types of jobs that are being created currently. I need to stop my son from saying this, but I always ask him every day, what are you going to be when you grow up? And I trained him to say, it hasn't been invented yet, but it's being invented now. And so it's about time that we start seeing what this looks like. So the next generation, we need to think about how many are going to go to college, because we all know the college-age traditional population is declining. One of the main reasons for that is they see the millennial generation, right, that came before them as saddled with student loan debt, and they think that they can actually learn as much or have greater trust in, and this will blow your mind, in finding information on Google or YouTube. And we'll discuss why that is problematic here in a moment, but all of you probably can guess that. Additionally, we need to reframe the question as far as who we're actually teaching. I mean, because most students are not 18 to 21-year-olds, right? Most of them by far are non-traditional students by definition, which doesn't really make a lot of sense because they're the majority, so they are traditional now, right? That being those that are older than 25 years of age, according to how federal financial aid is packaged. They work full-time, have families, right? Have other responsibilities. And so they're not looking to cut corners, they're looking to get a better life and get what they need and still, once again, continue supporting their families. So a very different kind of consideration. So with the future of education, what we're seeing is, yes, a bachelor's degree is absolutely still going to be necessary for long-term health, financial success, stability, etc. But we'll still need to continue providing those new skills as we move along. So micro-credentials, badging, certificates, as these new types of careers come out. I would say on average, we will all have to get some type of micro-credential or badge every 5 years minimum, right? That's minimum. And that can be something really small that could take, a few sessions or a week or 2 weeks for a workshop, or it could be a 6-month-long kind of certificate. So what we're going to need eventually, given the majority of the population, is more flexible on and off ramps for students that can start and stop without the financial penalty. Now, this is, of course, good for what we're looking at now with technology coming in. So here's the value proposition that we're seeing. We know, everyone in this room, that education is worth it, right? We can point to facts and state that, yes, you are going to have health insurance and retirement benefits, which, neither one of my in-laws, for instance, do. Neither one have college degrees, as an example. We're going to make more in a lifetime, right? And if you look at the reasons why students state that they don't, they still believe that it's not worth it, even though we can show them that it is. So we really need to clarify our kind of messaging on what type of skills that we're going to be giving them and the relevance. Okay, so now let's talk about how quickly we are moving. So who feels completely overwhelmed and like you have to learn a new tool every other week? That's me. I have to learn it. The rest of you are killing it. I would just say, for those that are streaming online, most did not raise their hands, so I wish I felt that way. So I just want to go through just a short history of disruptive ed tech and let you know that if you don't feel completely overwhelmed, then you're not really sane. You should really feel overwhelmed for many reasons, and I'll show you why. So you can go all the way back to the invention of writing. Remember, Socrates stated before that, everything was orally, right, transmitted and memorized. So the invention of writing, he said, was the worst thing to ever happen to humanity because we'd write things down and forget about them, right? So you go through each of these iterations, and there's a new technology that comes out that upends how we taught previously. And every time it's met with a great deal of consternation. So for instance, we moved from rote memorization with the advent of the chalkboard in the early 19th century, and students at Yale rioted and threw it out of a window, right? Because it upended, how they were taught, and once again, kind of station, et cetera. If you're old like me, or been teaching at least 20 years, you remember the panic of Google, right, in 1998, and everyone thought that we'd be thinking in search terms, right, and forget everything else. Or Wikipedia, right, so that was demonized and vilified, I remember. It's just quaint thinking of it now with everything that we had. But whenever I started teaching, I was at the back of the room as a teaching assistant changing light bulbs and projectors, okay? That's how I was taught in this way. I remember it was a big deal that we all had to move over to PowerPoint. I don't know if everyone remembers that in the early 2000s. And then we didn't have a learning management system, right? So you had to hand copy down grades, right, and then hand them or post them. So learning management systems was entirely new, right? So none of us were trained, well, except for the younger ones back here, but those that are old like me, we weren't trained to do that, right? We had to learn that on the job. Now, fast forward to everything that happened since then. The speed and the acceleration is just increasing to where instead of taking a decade or longer to get used to something, so 2007, you have the launch, of the iPhone. Did everyone have the first generation iPhone? No. Is everyone using AI right now? No. It took over 20 years after the stable launch of the Model T automobile for more people to be using cars than riding horses, right? So there's always that curve, right, of adoption. But it's faster and faster. So I just want to take you back. Luckily, thanks to Dr. Alsobrook, I was already developing and training myself in how to create online classes, because he was the dean of online, and all these new online programs. So when the pandemic hit, I was okay, right? But most of my colleagues never taught online. So in the rest of the world, most face-to-face teachers, especially those K through 12, never taught online. We all went through this massive Herculean effort and experiment to teach ourselves how do we actually do this, right, in that way? So that was 2020. So 2021 rolls around, we start lifting some of the restrictions, we're starting some hybrid classes, we're trying to get our feet under us, and not 6 months later, but generative AI hit. And where does it hit? The summer of 22, not where we predicted with the Stanford 800, which is going to be automating low-skilled manual labor type of repetitive activities, but the creative arts, right? It started there, completely upending our predictive model. So not only did we have to learn all of that, but now what do we do about this, right? So everyone, it launched November 2022, the stable model of ChatGPT, and we all went down for a long winter's nap, and we came back, and then the world freaked out, and we banned it in states like New York, right? We didn't know what to do at that time. So this is what you refer to in the healthcare profession as alarm fatigue, that being if you are in a hospital and you're around all these beeping elements, these heart rate monitors, et cetera, eventually doctors and nurses will tell you they tune it out, right? There's too much. We have too much being thrown at us. There are hundreds of API that are being released every day that do any number of things. So if you do not feel like this, then something is, you're superhuman, or I don't know what you're doing differently than I am. I'm trying to keep up with all of these on a weekly basis. So let's talk about, first off, kind of normalizing that. Everyone should feel overwhelmed, but you have time, right? So with all the research we've been doing and working with Ithaca Research Group and 20 other institutions, including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and all the other studies. We have dozens of studies. We're going to link to it in the presentation. You have all of our results, so you can see what students across the U.S. working in institutions that are vocational, community colleges, teaching institutions like I'm from, R1s, HBCUs, et cetera, we're seeing the same results, right? So, but we have time, right? And I'll tell you why here in a moment. But one of the questions that was sent in is, what is AI? And so let's start with the radical oversimplification, so I apologize, but there are three forms of AI, and it's been around since the 1950s, right? If you think about AI, we were presenting to a computer science class, and all the students were shocked, right? They thought it was brand new and just came out in 2022. So they were blown away to learn, oh my God, your great-grandfather had this. But the three main versions are going to be like computer vision, machine learning, and natural language processing. So that being dealing with pictures, dealing with numbers, and dealing with words. So, and different ways in which to organize and retrieve that information. So every time you go into Google and prove you're not a robot, you're actually helping a robot understand what a stoplight looks like. I hope everyone knows that. You're training their computer vision. But generative AI is different because it allows you to, and I can keep going forever, so tell me when we get close so you can cut me off. But generative AI means it makes something, right? So if you think of ChatGPT, generative pre-trained transformers, it takes whatever you give it and can rearrange it, and you can query it and have an output in different ways. So that's the difference now, is the low barrier to access for the free versions of it, but that it also makes stuff, and everyone has access to it, to script, to code, to make videos now with Sora AI, to images, to any number of things. And we'll talk about what it can do today and what it's going to be able to do 5 years from now. But one of the main things that is misunderstood in talking with a lot of faculty is that they seem to think of it as kind of Google. It's not Google. It's not pulling from the internet live, right? It's pulling from what it was trained on, right? And the original one was trained on the internet that's freely available up until 2021. And it could then reorganize things. But if it didn't know the answer, it makes it up. That's hallucinations. So once again, in 2022, it made a whole bunch of stuff up. I was very disappointed to find that out. It's not as much of a problem now, but it gives as good as it gets. So if you want something accurate, give it something accurate. So give it the document you want it to summarize. Give it, once again, a PDF. Give it something, and then ask it specifics about that. So I just want to kind of get that out of the way there. But what we know is the genie's not going back in the bottle, and as one of our colleagues who's from Argentina would say in South America, the music has already started, so we need to dance. So there's a lot of lawsuits. There's a lot of things that are going to change. Who's going to win in the long term? We don't know. For the next 5 years, it's going to be Google and Microsoft, right? So those are the two main ones that are going to win because they have an established ecosystem and they can fend off a lot of the lawsuits. But it's in everything. So just remember that it went into search engines, and think of like it went into Snapchat and social media first, right, back in 2022, right? So, and then it went into every search engine, and now it's in everything like JSTOR, right? So any academic database is going to have this in it as well. And not to mention, if you have the pilot of Copilot, you all have access to it. So remember that Microsoft is going to be bankrolling OpenAI. So ChatGPT 4 is Bing. It is Copilot. With additional training wheels on it, right, if you play with it. This is actually good news because we have the pilot, and you don't have anything to worry about yet because it's not as amazing as we would have thought. So you have some time. But it still changes how we're thinking. So our next textbook that's coming out is on teaching English composition in the age of generative AI. So what do we do if it can do these things? But first we need to talk about AI literacy, which is going to be at the foremost of any endeavor of any educational institution from K through 12 up to post-secondary education and graduate studies. That's just understanding what it does, what it is, and what it can't do. That's all AI literacy is. And so I'll give you an idea of what I mean by how I experienced it. This is a personal journey, but this is someone else's slide, but still everyone goes through this. So it launches, we're doing studies on 6 other generative AI writing tools in the fall of 2022. ChatGPT launches, and I start playing with it, and it is amazing. It's easy to access, it's phenomenal. You think it can do anything, it's magic, right? And then you realize, oh, it's making stuff up, all those citations aren't real, oh, you get really bummed out, and then you kind of level off. You're like, okay, once you get to this stage, then you can start using it, right? So to actually train your students and or to release things to the public. But you have to go through that disappointment loop, kind of, the phases of grief. But this is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So everyone's familiar with this in psychology, that being, if you think something's easy for you, you feel that it's going to be easy for everyone. And if something's difficult for you, you think that it's difficult for everyone. So in the same way we apply that to AI, a lot of people overestimate it. They don't read what it outputs, and then they get a lawsuit. Or they underestimate it and don't realize, oh, I could just take those meeting minutes we just had for that department meeting and feed it in and have it, format that for me and output it, which would have taken me an hour, right? So that's the two things right there. But as far as what it can do, so this is a major misconception. I was at several international conferences in the past 7 days, and people, international experts, were still showing the free version of ChatGPT and the limitations of it. And they kept saying, it can't do this, it can't do this. Yes, it can. But that's going to be the paid version of ChatGPT 4 or what's in Copilot, right, in that way. But remember, in the initial launch, trained on the internet, it hallucinated, so it's based on the premise that it has to answer a question you ask. If it doesn't know the answer to that question, like what did I do for my summer vacation last year, it's not on the internet, so it's going to make it up. It's like you had a wonderful beach vacation with your family, and you adopted a dog named Rover, and so it'll completely make something up like that. But at the time, it was unimodal, right? You could only do one thing, so make images or make text or make script. Now it's multimodal. It can access the internet. You can hook it up to databases. It can access things in real time. So just kind of be aware of what the capabilities are now. Most students don't know this, by the way. They're still using the free tools and are not this savvy. They're just copying, for instance, discussion prompts and putting it in and putting it in a discussion post. They're not really that exciting. But if you're using 3.5, the main kind of goal you want to take away from this, the main point is it's very limited. And if this is what you're basing what it can do on, you're right. It is really poor as far as the output. It is not that great. Because this is what it can do now. So those that are really savvy can have a through line with different types of output and say, okay, I need a logo for, if you're teaching graphic design, you know, an eco-friendly water bottle company that has a dog as a logo, right? So then output me that. Okay, now output, once again, a video, right, of a commercial showing that. Now output social media posts for that. Now reformat that for LinkedIn, now Instagram, now Facebook, right? So you can go back and forth between these. Now make me a website, right? So a perfectly basic functioning website you can do. Say, output me a photo carousel with HTML and JavaScript, right? So the more complex things, you're going to want, you know, someone, I'm sorry, what was your name? Cybersecurity expert? Don. So you're going to want him to help you with the more advanced things, but it can do the basic stuff. So just want to show you can go back and forth and back and forth. So what this means for teaching, we'll get to this in a minute, is if you teach, you know, biology, let's say, you can give them an image of a cell in a book. They can take a picture of with their phone and say, I don't understand what a nucleus is. Can you explain it to me? Now explain it to me like I'm 5, right? Now explain it to me like, so you can have it reiterate things and go back and forth between visual imagery and text. So it can do a lot more stuff. So there is there's an easy way to get overwhelmed, right? There's all these API that come out daily. You have all of these AI czars and AI gurus that come up with all these use cases you have to know as an educator. You don't. You don't need 200 tools as an educator. You don't need more than one tool as an educator if you don't want. Because what's going to happen is it's all going into what we use every day anyway. So once they change the pricing plan for educational institutions, everyone's going to have what I've been playing with for the last month, and that's Copilot. So what Copilot does, and what everyone's concerned about, we'll talk about lawsuits, is it protects your data. So that's the number one concern with feeding something into something like ChatGPT, Bard, which is now Gemini, Llama, all these other large language models, is it can then spill out, it can leak, right? So data privacy is a nightmare. But with these new versions, think of Google is integrating it into Chromebooks. And so my son, when there's a snow day, gets a Chromebook and goes home with him. So his generation coming up, it's going to be normal for them to have access to this because it's in that. So Google has the semantic overlay to protect their network. That's why they have the K through 12 contracts. Microsoft, right, you purchase. So you can put in financials, you can put in student identification, you can put in assessment data. It's not going anywhere. It doesn't train outside of who has access to it based on the permissions you give them by way of IT in your institution. So I just want to show you where we're going, right? The good news is this shouldn't freak you out, though, even though it's in Word and PowerPoint and Excel, because it's fairly prosaic, right, as far as the output compared to ChatGPT. If you go into Word or go into your email and say, you know, ask my colleague for a meeting next Friday, it'll say, I hope this email finds you well. Should we have a meeting next Friday, right? So it's very literal because they put extra guardrails on it. So they're not going to be able to write an entire essay, right, on the Civil War using this. Here we go, moving on. Okay, so where are we now? What we do know is most students regularly use AI, but not for the reason we're thinking. Most faculty do not regularly use AI, again, but not for the reason we're thinking. I should start off by stating that most students, if you talk to them, you survey them, they know there's no repercussions based on how honest they can be. They're using it for a range of things, mostly in middle school and high school as counselors, right? Asking questions they're too embarrassed to ask their friends or their parents, et cetera. And so we've also seen studies on suicide counseling using Replica and other AI to help talk people, back into connecting with family, et cetera. And so we have positive results there. They are using it to get started, right? So they're using it to study. So here is a list of terms, help me study and cram for this exam, right? So quiz me on these, right? But they, as well as all of us, that we have our AI ambassadors that regularly use these tools, staff and faculty, they're all using it the same way to get started. I mean, okay, I got to write this paper, I got to, write this report, I need to take these minutes, give me an outline, give me, once again, how to get started. So they are using it for that and then going back and changing and cutting and moving things around. But they do know that AI is important. They're scared of it because there's not a lot of training that we've given them as far as what they can and can't do with it. So there's this apprehension, right? So they know they need to learn it, but they're afraid of getting in trouble for learning it. So it's this wonderful kind of cyclical thing that we have. And they're very, very aware of the ethical implications. So we need to be aware of how sensitive they are about that because they understand the impact that deep fakes can have. And you've probably seen more reports coming out recently from high school students of people making deep fake nudes of classmates. And that is very destructive to the community, and they feel that. So they know what unethical use of AI can do. So they're scared of it, and they want us to tell them what's okay. So let's talk about the lawsuits. So everyone's probably familiar with all the lawsuits that are going on. Those will not stop. Most of the lawsuits that you're seeing go back over a year. So, the New York Times lawsuit that everyone's probably familiar with, they were in talks with OpenAI for over a year and using their model to train, and then it got good enough to actually spit out correct information, and then things went sideways. But you have all of these, especially internationally, we're still going to see lawsuits, for data training sets, et cetera, for years. Here's what's going to happen. We know where it's going because Adobe showed us the way, and other licensing agreements, is that people are going to pay for the right to use a data set that a company has, right, and base it on a subscription model and or pay them X amount annually to do so. And what we're going to see with the lawsuits is most are going to win out with fair use as an argument, and they'll also state you could opt out of training anytime you wanted anyway, so you didn't go in and turn it off. So that's what they're actually stating. But eventually we're going to have this in everything. That doesn't mean, however, right now it's a simple situation. One of the questions that came through is, what does this mean for academic rigor, integrity, and honesty? Well, we'll start off with Turnitin. I mentioned a colleague just contacted me before this talk and sent me the report like this of what her professor sent her, accusing her of plagiarism, which she was very distraught about and asked me what to do about it. So I had to send her all the studies and show how it is going to give you many false positives, especially if you use Grammarly or other AI writing tools that most institutions and writing centers suggest. But it also disproportionately impacts non-native speakers and neurodivergent individuals. So keep that in mind, especially if you're going to go over to going back to blue books and or entirely oral exams, because those two types of assessments disproportionately impact those communities. So I want to keep that in mind. Now, there's tons of ways in which you can AI-proof your classroom if that's what you want. So you can say changing how you assess, change, once again, what they do. The surefire thing that I do if I really don't want them to use it is have them output in a different media than what the assignment is. So for instance, I teach along with AI art history, for instance, believe it or not. And so if they're going to do a formal analysis, I will have them write up the prompt without any descriptors for an image, and the closer they get to the image as an output in an image generator, right, the more points they get by way of stylistic criteria. You can't cheat doing that because it's a different medium that way. So, but there's lots of ways, breaking things apart, open-ended questions, have students grade each other. They're really bulldogs on thinking what's fair, right? So that being, no, they use this, they didn't write that, so they'll call each other out in that way as well. But you don't have to worry so much about that yet. at being most students hate using AI tools. We've done dozens of studies across the US, across media, from web design to writing to poetry, creative writing, right? So sciences, you name it. And we have the same responses across the board, and we'll tell you what the indicators are for that. But they are very resistant to using it. We actually did a study of 150 English composition students in the fall. Many students just dropped out the first day when we told them they had to use the tool. They're like, nope, I'm not using it, I'm dropping out, I'm not touching it, right? So for art generators as well, in the same way, if they want to be an artist, they're like, no, I'm out, I'm not using it, you can't make me touch it. So there's this false myth out there that all students are clamoring or champing at the bit to do this. Now, why is that? This is the reason why we found out. It took us 2 years and dozens of studies, but we wondered how come some students were fine using it and others were not. And it comes down to something we all are going to have to deal with, right, moving forward. So it's all about mindset. Learning the tools are easy, right? But you have to have the mindset that it's okay to use them for certain things, and how you're using them, you have to feel it's ethical and it's appropriate. So the 3 reasons, and we'll talk about AI guilt, because that's all of us right here. But for the students, number 1, if they were at a vocational school or they were learning something that was part of a trade they were hoping to go on and get a job in, hated it, right? They would actually come out and say, this is awful, this is horrible, why are you teaching me this? I don't have a job, right? So the fear of being replaced is number 1. No surprise, because of all Americans in a survey of 2017, the fear of being replaced by robots ranked above death for us. So we're more afraid of robots than death. The second one is identity loss, which is very interesting. This occurred whenever you had creative types or those that identified with what they were learning, that being, I'm a musician, I'm a poet, I'm an artist, right? And so if it can do that, then what am I, right, in this way? So there's a challenge to one's identity. That's personal identity, right? So once again, I'm a cinephile, I love movies, but I don't make movies for a living, right? So that's going to be different from the third one, which is your expertise. That's your professional identity. That being, we find that the groups least likely to adopt this technology early on were those in computer science and English, for obvious reasons, right? That being, they like, no, we teach artificial intelligence, we're the experts, right? So we understand it. That's just the fake stuff, right? So I've heard it referred to over and over again as the real artificial intelligence. But for us, this is what's interesting. Even all of those faculty that I've worked with are very pro AI and how it can help students and help them think critically and the ways in which they can use it really collaboratively in the classroom. They won't use it themselves for grading to save time. And so you have English professors that spend 60 to 70 hours a week just grading papers. And I'm just like, you told your students how you can feed that in and much more quickly identify how they can make it better in a fraction of the time. They're like, no, we were taught we had to spend 20 minutes per paper or we're not doing our job, right? So AI guilt. So we're going to have to get used to this idea that the value of something is not directly equated to the time and effort that goes into it, right? So in the same way, you can think of it as a graphic designer with 30 years experience, that being, you often have clients, say, oh, I'm paying you $5,000 and you did an hour's worth of work. It's like, you're not paying me for the time of work, you're paying me for the skill that I had to develop in order to do that in an hour. So you want to think of it more in those terms, but this is real. This is really an issue for us. Okay, so let's talk about where we're going. What should we be doing about this, especially in a liberal arts context, right, in this way? So the purpose of an undergraduate degree, if you think about it really, as opposed to high school and graduate degrees, is to bring a student up to speed with what's happening in a given field. That's vocabulary, that's the major arguments, the major theories, the major methodologies, what's already been done, right? Where are we now with kinesiology, or where are we now with physics? Right, so the thing is, we can do that incredibly rapidly now. That being the time on task it takes to learn vocabulary or to learn the basics of a given field has been reduced by half. We've shown that with experimental programs like Aircol 42. So if you're talking about just learning vocabulary, we can set you up with these various tools which will quiz students and reinforce these ideas in multiple ways. Are you a visual learner? Do you want to watch a video of it? Do you want it to read it to you? Do you want to have bullet points? Do you want to tell you what we had it recite Dante's Inferno as Mickey Mouse and then as Star Wars, right? So explain it in terms of of Star Wars to me. And it'll do it, right? It's pretty good at that. So we can do that relatively quickly. So what skills are left? It's all the skills that you are teaching them and that we love teaching. It's all of those durable, transferable skills, all of those things from empathy, communication, teamwork, right, leadership, all the stuff that you get out of going to college for. But the most important one, bar none, we found with our studies is metacognition. Teaching students how to get, right, what's in between A to B. Because now what you don't want to do with assignments is one and done, right? So in the age of AI, okay, come to lectures. This is how I was taught. Like, let's do a lecture. You're going to sit in this hall for 15 times, for an hour each, and at the end you're going to turn in a paper, right? So, but the one and done doesn't really work anymore. It's what happens in the middle that's important, because we know what B looks like. We know what they should be able to do, but learning how they get there is unique for each student. In this way. So here's a visual. That being, students, as we mentioned, stated that, I trust Google and YouTube more than my professors. Right, okay, yes, you can get data from Google and YouTube. Yes, you can get information, that being, when something happened, what's the latest, open source model that was just launched by, OpenAI, et cetera. But when you start off into knowledge, I mean, connecting the dots, how do these things go together? It starts breaking down as to watching a 30-second YouTube video versus what you give them in the classroom. And especially once we move over to wisdom, right, in this way. That being, yes, I can go and I can Google and say, okay, what is the latest AI skill that I need, right? That's great, I can do that. I see it says I need to learn this, or I need to learn this coding language. But where does that fit within the kind of ecosystem of that field? Where does that fit within what I'm going to need to know and connecting it with other areas, right? So you're connecting the dots for them and showing them how to do so for themselves moving forward. Here we go. How much time do we got left? We're doing good. Okay. So here's really the difference, which I think is positive, but it is an adjustment. And students, again, also are going to have to adjust. So for instance, everyone thinks that lectures are dead. They're not dead. Actually, students believe over 17% of types of classes should still be lecture-based, right, when polled nationwide. So there's certain things that they prefer, right, you break down for them, right, really complex, things that can be turned into a story, et cetera, versus skills like, let's apply this new algebra equation, right? So that's very different than what we're doing here. And so what we're going to be doing with the rest of it is like the flipped classroom model, if you're familiar with that. That being, go and learn these vocab terms, right? But when you come in, we're going to apply it in a real world setting, and you're going to work in a group, and I'm going to show you and mentor you and show the type of behavior to be modeled on as to how you should be doing this, right? So that's where we're at, and many of you are probably already doing this, right? So it's nothing new, but we have time for this because people are adjusting. Systems take time to turn. Ships are very big. In a single institution, you have different entities, right? So every institution has different schools, colleges, departments. Within that, every classroom is its own little kingdom, right? So once again, what you're doing in one English classroom does not necessarily equate to what's happening in another English classroom, depending on what the policies are with that instructor. And so it's going to take a while for everyone to get on the same page as to what are the best practices. So we had one of our AI ambassadors, and I'll talk about that in a minute, who stated when accused of dragging his feet and adopting this, he's like, we're not dragging our feet, we haven't seen the best practices that have come out of our field to show us how to do it right yet. So, but this is the good news. I mean, once you decide that you want to learn it, that's easy, right? You can do that in a 30-minute session. We can have workshops, and we can have everyone, largely proficient at an intermediate level, right, within one afternoon. That's not a problem because everything's free. That's the good thing about it, is it will teach you how to learn about how to use it. So that's not the problem once you understand the fundamentals. But integrating AI is not all or nothing. This is kind of the idea of a syllabus policy that we have. I'm sure that you have something similar in that most institutions have this now. You have a syllabus template and then 3 possible policies. One is you can't use AI for any reason whatsoever in this class. The next one is under certain circumstances you can use AI. The third is you can use it for whatever you want, right? So, and then of course most faculty opt for the first 2. But that's what it is. It's not an all or nothing though, right? So number one, everyone needs to talk about it, right? We'll talk about why that's so significant in a moment. but you don't have to then let them just run wild with it and not show you how they're using it, right? So you can have them show their chat log, you can show them, show your work, right? So you can have them do that with AI as well. Here we go. So as far as for teaching, you can start small. I use it to do really boring things like make rubrics, right? So everyone loves making rubrics for every assignment. We know that's best practices. That's very labor and time intensive. What are the criteria? You know, is it going to be a decaying average? You know, what specifically are, once again, how detailed do you want each of the grading criteria to be? So it can do that relatively easily and almost instantaneously. Updating syllabi, that being, okay, I need you to take this syllabi, but I want to add a section on parabolas this week or something. So it'll go in and automatically do the first draft for you, which would take you a while to go through. Now, this is up to you. This is one of the most contentious ones, however. It's great at lesson plans, so it'll give you a first draft, right? You can do syllabus after syllabus after syllabus, and you can go back and edit it. It'll do it very rapidly. But grading assistance, this is one of the most contentious things, which is very interesting, is we've been using AI for this for decades, right? If you want to go back to ACT as well as PackBack, right? We've had these tools that automatically graded and provided feedback that you could tack onto learning management systems. This isn't new, but we know that across the board, students prefer your voice, right? They want your validation. They want your feedback as to how they did. So that is a very contentious one. It can do it, and I can show you how to do that with your rubric, right? So rubric, assignment, give me the output, and then you can tailor it. Anyway. Let's talk about institutional strategy. So what do you do? Well, number one, the reason why it's so difficult to do anything about AI is, number one, we're in silos, right? So everyone is in different areas. They teach different subjects. They have different ideas about what pedagogy should be and what students should get out of a class, and even what academic honesty is. And so that is a pediment. But you don't have to start from scratch. What we did was we started in 2021 with the AI ambassadors. Identify people that are already doing it, right? You likely, people in this room have probably played more than others with this technology. So identify those people, get them together, and form, once again, a little task force or working group. Talk to each other. How are you using it? What's working for you? And once again, what's best practice you're finding in English versus math versus biology, et cetera. So that's the ambassadors. And so you always know you have someone in your area that you can go to and go, okay, I don't see how this relates, once again, to music theory, right? So help me out here, right? So also Brooke knows that, but that's something that they're still doing by hand, right? They're still annotating by hand in music theory classes. Anyway, so start off with that, but you want to get faculty, staff, and students, right? So if you want to get real buy-in, bring students into the equation, that being, what have they heard of it? How are they using it? How are their friends using it, right? So having those conversations. But the trainings come up. So there's not a one-size-fits-all policy, that being some faculty want only on-demand training. Some people don't want to admit how much they know or don't know, and so you don't want to embarrass anyone for that. So you have on-demand, so you can say, okay, what are the basics? What is AI anyway? All the way up to, let's get together and I'm going to ask you questions about what didn't work for me, and you tell me what has been working for you. So we have both. So we have a Learning Academy group, right, that meets weekly, one on ground, one online. So those that don't want to come to campus or be there can meet online and even keep their cameras off if they want. And those that meet in person and want to talk about it, right, in that way that can. Other ways to incentivize is going to be badges and certificates. So you can, of course, say, you are an AI ambassador, you are whatever. So, give them that type of information. But then do case studies, like your students and your faculty are going to be different than mine, right, in this way. So, see what's happening in your classes, right? So do studies and get feedback informally or informally, depending upon your IRB's procedure, on what's actually happening there. All right, here we go. But here's kind of the major takeaways for the session, is that they're going to use it. They're probably not going to be using it the way in which you think. That being, the students who were cheating before are still going to be bad actors now. That doesn't change. But most of them want to learn this technology, and they want you to show them how to do it ethically. So they're going to use it. They already are using it. We all get up in the morning and ask Alexa what the weather is if we need an umbrella. I asked, once again, AI to give me directions to drive here. We do it all the time. It's just behind. It's under the the hood, right? So now it's taken out of that and everyone can use it. So here's kind of the second bullet point is you don't want them to use it. This was two of the questions that were forwarded to me. Tell them why they can't use it, right? So say, okay, 4 classes that students don't know why they need to take, right? So let's say I'm not a quantitative person. I did not like math in school, for instance. So it's like I had to get through it. So if you don't want me to use the tool like a calculator, right, tell me why I need to learn these specific analytical skills, right, that are going to benefit me, right? So why should I, not use it for this particular assignment? And they'll listen to you, right? If you tell them that you can use it for this, but not this. And here's why you can't use it for that. So that's why it's really a don't ask, don't tell. It's really been swept under the rug in most institutions because at every institution we've talked to, few have policies and most leave it up to the individual faculty because they're viewing it as a faculty teaching problem, not as a research or an institutional or a graduate student problem, quote unquote problem. So people just aren't talking about it, and then they run the turned in report. It says likely AI. They immediately send it up, right, and then unfairly may accuse students of that. We're having a flood of that right now because they didn't talk about it to begin with. Like, did you tell them they couldn't use it? Well, you have to tell them that first, or you can't, bring them up on plagiarism charges for it. So you couldn't use this for the assignment. We discussed it. Here's why, and then you can support that. But really, here's if you do want them to use it, and it's not like a big deal. Maybe you want them to brainstorm on a given topic, right? But the final may be a presentation, right? So have them brainstorm with AI, and then they can copy the chat and just send you the chat, right? So here's what I did, and you can see how they're thinking. Are they actually? What is their thoughts, and what is AI giving them? So you can see their thought process. If they're just copying and pasting what it comes back with, then obviously they're not using it right, and it's not helping them. So that's one way you can do it. But above all, everything that you're doing remains critical because there are still things that AI is not going to be able to do for the foreseeable future. And that's really all of those humanic skills we've been discussing. So as far as, learning the bones of the body and or, learning basic algebra, sure, we can automate, some of that teaching, but the elements of how to apply it and engage with other humans, still is going to involve us. So as a general rule, don't let the students use AI for everything, but also don't let them use it, don't not talk about it at all, right, in that way. So you want to discuss, why it could be used, why it's not going to help them to learn the particular skill set or topic in that. So really it's balancing that notion of existential pessimism, which is what's the point of any of this? This destroys everything we've been doing. It doesn't, you're fine. And then others are like, let's adopt everything all at once, right? So let's push it this way. So we got to find a balance there. So to help you, we have dozens of studies. This links directly. Hopefully we can share the PowerPoint with everyone. If not, I can email it to you. You can email me directly here or call me. I'll give you all the studies. If there's a specific field you're interested in, I can show you what students are actually doing or what they're not doing, with it, what they say about it, et cetera. But we'll open it up for questions. I think we have 10 minutes left, right? Perfect. Okay, questions.
What's the most recent example of working with students that you have using in a classroom?
Sure. Monday we have our weekly training session for graduate students. I primarily work with them now. And so we were looking at writing literature reviews using Perplexity AI and how that can be used also with JSTOR, elicit consensus, et cetera, and how we can connect that with the large language models to ensure accuracy and look for not crises, but flashpoints in a field or disagreements or framing a research question, right? Looking for the gaps in the literature. So that's what we were doing Monday. Yep.
So I teach in the art department, and I do have a lot of students that are very nervous and apprehensive about how AI is going to affect their future
Yep.
careers, specifically students that are looking into animation. So what advice should I give them in order to alleviate that fear and kind of help them push forward? Because I've told them that it's here to stay.
Mm-hmm.
Especially generative AI, I mean, it's a little scary, especially for creatives, like how are we supposed to sell our work, how that creative integrity, etc.
Please email me. I wrote a book on that. So it's it's Creative Convergence, the AI Renaissance of Art and Design, and we presented last week at College Art Association on it. I have 5 co-authors in various fields. So the short answer is for fine artists, it's going to be fine. That doesn't sound right, does it? They don't have as much to worry about in the sense that there's going to be 3 different ways in which content is created, which is true right now. We just don't think of it this way. That being content that is entirely automated. So think of, stoplights. That being, we put an algorithm in place to run stoplights. We don't want to mess with it until something goes wrong, and then you put a human in the loop to see, okay, what went wrong? But most content is kind of automated behind the scenes. I mean, most data in all of history is produced in the last 90% in the last 2 years, right? Probably more than that now, since that all of us are dumping things back out of ChatGPT on the web. But the second type of content is going to be the next most common, and that's human-in-the-loop content. That's where you're working with a tool to help you. So it might be, Photoshop. It might be, rephrase this for me as far as, word catching, misspelling or a grammatical mistake. The third is what they will be doing, which will be the most valuable moving forward, and that is completely human-created. So something that is only made by a human hand and mind is going to be the rarest type of product, and will be valued as such. So if you go back to the last, we're entering the 5th Industrial Revolution. If you go back to the first one, you'll note that we didn't stop having craftsmen make chairs and or people make paintings, right? They became more expensive, right? So they became artisanal. So your artists are fine. Animation, game design, graphic design, web design, all of those, it's a bit different. They want to focus on the fundamentals, and this is true also for writing and everything else, is the fundamentals of a given discipline are going to be the most important, because if they know that, there's going to be a tool to help them get to that or express that. So yes, basic 2D animation will be, if you think like Pixar, those early stages and repetitive stages are going to be animated. But think of it in terms of being a director, that being, even if you're not a cinematographer, a gaffer, you don't understand, editing, you still need to know the principles of storytelling. You need to know the principles of filmmaking. You need to know, what, a low-angle backlit scene is going to be communicating, when you need, the background kind of noise or B-roll for this in order to transition between films. Where is the, what did Hitchcock call it? The MacGuffin, right? The MacGuffin, the thing that pushes it forward to the next one, right? So you need all those basics, and it's true for the fine arts as well. So color theory, composition, these design elements, what communicates what visually and how. So how does form, once again, help communicate content? So that's the most important thing that they can have moving forward, because they can have tools, right, create that for them once they know that. But if they don't, and you just say, generate me a logo for a dog food company, it's going to be a pretty poor logo, right, in that way. So they need to understand color theory, the principles, contrast, design elements, what would be an appropriate way to communicate healthy dog food versus, one for like an aged dog, right? So there are these nuances that they learn to connect form and content. But email me, I'll send you the book. Yes. I think it was you, sorry. Yes. Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Yeah, quick question. With all of these tools that are available now, most of them are free.
Yep.
Where would you suggest somebody start
Yep.
playing?
Sure. So for everyone, you don't have to learn. I mean, come on, I knew nothing about this 3 years ago, and I have a background in art. So everyone here is going to be an expert in 2 years. Let's just be honest, okay? But starting off, you don't have to be, an expert in machine learning and algorithms. You want to start by just playing with it. Just open ChatGPT or open Bing, right, and say, give me a recipe for lasagna, right? Or, give me things that I should be doing when I'm vacationing in Kansas City, right? So just see how it comes back and how it actually works, right? So that's the number one thing is, oh, that's how it works? Okay. It got that wrong. It got that right. It's good at this. It's not that good at that. So just start off by just playing with it, right? Low stakes. In the same way with your students, most of them are afraid to use it as well. Because what happens, we found, especially with art students as well, is that students don't know how to do prompt engineering or how to think through a problem. So all they do is take your prompt and say, okay, discuss the implications of the Franco-Prussian War on modern day geopolitics in Ukraine, right? So they're like, what? Right? So all they're gonna do is copy that sentence and paste it and say, write a post on that. They don't know how to think through it, and it's going to give them a pretty crappy answer, let's just be honest, because they didn't ask the right question. They weren't specific in what they wanted the output to be. And so it's the same thing with English, with writing, and with art. They'll start off with, give me a new Pokemon that's a water and fire type that's going to be blue and white. This is an actual example from the book. And then, output that. And so if they don't get it the first time, they give up. They're like, oh, this is awful. This can't do anything. So they don't know how to use the technology yet because they haven't been told how to think through it. You have to think iteratively through it because the first thing that comes out, you don't want. You want, okay, that's great, but replace that. I don't think we should have broccoli in this lasagna recipe. Okay, we don't want that. Brown sugar, no. So you iteratively go back and forth until you get what you want, but you have to know where you're going. And that's why we often use the analogy of the co-pilot. Yes, you can have AI set the autopilot and set, once again, the coordinates, right, that you're going to be flying. But if you don't know where you're going, then it doesn't matter, right? So you're just going to crash into a mountain. You have to have some idea of what the output should look like, right? And students just don't. They'll stare at it like a blank page. We thought, okay, we give them the tools. They're just going to go and then run, gangbusters and be writing about, with Comp 1, write what you did last summer. And we're going to do a basic essay structure of introduction, main body, conclusion. And they just stare at you, right? Because they don't know what to do. You need to teach them, to walk them through the steps, to think through the steps of how that works. So to answer your question, just play with it. Just put in some things. Say, write me a story. What was a really fun one? I always have it reframe things. Like I love Inferno and the voice of Mickey Mouse. It's like, gosh, Gaffy. So it'll go through, as like, Virgil and Dante going back and forth. So you can do really entertaining things like that. But just play with it starting off. Oh, someone else had a question next to you. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, you want tools. We need tons of tools, but the problem is it's paralysis. It's alarm fatigue, right? There are new things. I have 5 different specialists that I have scouting different areas. Every week I touch base with because you can't. We have those that are doing video tools, those that are doing for scripting and for animation and game design. We have those that are doing arts. Yes.
I'm just curious. You mentioned fine arts. You mentioned that. What's your feeling on music?
Ah.
That's been a lot where
Yep.
people lyrics writing to actually write melodies, harmonies, things like that. Have you encountered any of those issues, problems, things like that?
No, that's a great question. We were at a conference on Saturday talking to students from across 13 different institutions, and the music teacher actually came up with the same question. So I sent her some examples. There are some tools, but music, like art, if you just put in, give me a portrait of a woman holding a flower, you're going to be able to say that's not good, right? So in the same way as music, you're like, give me a pop melody, right, with 4 verses and a hook that has something to do with cars, and then output that with this tempo. It'll do it, but you're like, okay, it did it, but it's not good. So yes, it's not going to be as big of a problem with music. However, we've been using AI to remix music and all that. I was driving here, and I'm like, 5 of the songs on repeat were all just sampled from earlier songs, right, with a few verses on top. And I was like, okay, because the head of the Grammy stated that in order to win a Grammy, it needs to be at least 30% human-only content, right? So how do you determine what the percentage is, right? So how are you separating it out in that way? So yes, I can show you the tools, but it's going to be less of a problem because if they're already students that are familiar with the auditory software and the remixing and all of those, like we have at a radio station, they're going to stick with that because it's what they know. Those that are coming up that don't know, right, that's the ones that'll start playing with this, right? So they're like my son's age. So to give you an example, this summer, he's on the spectrum, so he stays at home with me in the summer. So while I'm writing books, he's off, looking at his Pokemon cards. He'll come over occasionally and go, let's make a Pokemon, but this time it should be a grass and fire type, it should be scaly and green, and it should have spikes. And so use AI to do that for me, Daddy. So I'll do it. So we make him that, and he's like, okay, now ask AI what it should be called, right? So it needs to have these things, so then it'll put it together. So he's already worked out that he can make anything he wants, and then we put it in the form of a card, and then we can, send it out and get it printed. So we have hundreds of cards now of every toy that he has, plus all these fake Pokemon he made up. But it's the same thing, right? So his generation are also playing with those music creation tools. But those in college now, don't worry about it. So that's why we have this lag time. So you have a few years before those that come up that have been using these on a daily basis, that are integrated into their workflow. That's the hardest thing we found for faculty, staff, and students, is it's easy to use them. It's hard to change how you work. So I have administrators all the time saying, I wish, I could come to you and we could do a training so I could learn how to do assessment reports and all these, boring paperwork, assignments, et cetera. But I just don't have the time to learn to save time, right? And so we have this kind of cyclical thing again. Yeah.
Do you suggest in our next profile that we include language about this, if people notice?
Yeah, oh yes, everyone should have per,
Generalizations to, as long as it's here, we're all a little bit pregnant, and we should discuss it and have it in general terms. None of us are not artistic, but in the business world.
oh, business, oh, I got great stuff for you. Oh, this business is great. We present regularly. Yeah. Digital marketing, business, oh.
Just not only marketing, but in the very concrete set of business.
Yeah, no, everyone should have, especially if you're going to be accusing students of using these tools for yeah, then, but just a statement, right? So what can you use it for, just to make it transparent.
Say we don't use it.
Yeah, I'm going to say, don't use it.
We have tried students with, similar words that aren't coming up with similarities that turn it in, but it's nevertheless and will comes in our answers.
Yep, and or tapestry, mosaic, there are specific words that keep coming up that it likes. But again, we need to be careful and state that being, don't use this tool because it's a different way of generating things. It's not outright copying and pasting verbatim from other things. It's predicting what the next word will be based upon what you asked it, and then outputting an example of what it thinks you want. And so it's all, according to the U.S. Copyright Office, all the text you can copyright, right? The imagery, we'll talk about that. We have to change some things with imagery in order to get that copyrightable. But so that's why we have to be clear is like, don't use this specific tool, even though it's not really blatant plagiarism, right? So that there's a gray area that we're going to live in for the next few years. Other questions? I love questions.
Are you seeing anything in terms of AI and mental health care? Like, I've heard a little bit about
Yes.
that, like crisis lines,
Uh-huh.
like text bots, things like that.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, where the field is at.
Sure. It's in its nascent phase, so it's still babies. So just wait till it grows up. But yeah, there's right now it's not recommended that it be completely AI for like suicide hotlines and other things. It does have specific words that you can set it up to where it will trigger connection with an actual human if something is said. But we're not to the point to where it can deliver the same level of service as a licensed counselor, therapist, or psychiatrist. However, with that being said, we do, as I mentioned, have some very promising studies that come out for personal use. And when you use anything like Replica or Pi or any of these personal assistants, they're actually very positive, right, in this way, very affirmational. And so we find that people, they did a study, those that were suicidal or depressed, had them use this and talking out, a lot of the things that they felt they wouldn't be able to discuss. You don't want to tell, your husband or your friend or your parents that you're suicidal, right? So, but once talking it out with someone and working through it, they were more apt to reach out then for social help and to relatives and family and family members. Again, that's not, however, licensed counseling. That's just allowing them to talk, right, to validate their feelings, which is something that we really underappreciate in the digital age when you have, a great deal of anxiety, isolation, and depression from, the generation going through COVID. And so just being able to talk to someone about it, not feeling weak and or isolated or somehow broken because of it, is useful. But no, we're still a ways off there. And the reason I bring that up is, several people it did give them wrong advice, and there were some deaths involved, so that's why it's not ready. So go ahead.
Changing gears a bit, are there resources that you suggest that we can and should share with students to teach them how to prompt well, in terms of supporting the right use of the tools?
Sure. There's way too many. But again, don't reinvent the wheel. There are 3 other R1 institutions with some wonderful resources I've sent to our provost office that I'm happy to share with you. Just email me. Here's a good way to go about it. We don't want to replace critical thinking or automate critical thinking. We want them to use it to understand how to put something together, how to think through a problem, to critically evaluate, how to make things better. That being, how would I improve my essay that I wrote? How would I make this argument stronger? Where are the holes in my argument, right? So they can use it for those purposes and shouldn't have any problems with academic dishonesty. We're all good? Yes, sir.
Google Gemini kind of had a tough week.
Yep.
In your opinion, does that come from programming or?
You mean how they get there?
Yeah, they've kind of had some backlash over the past few weeks or last week.
Oh, you mean about the image generation being pulled offline? Yeah. Okay. So everyone knows everyone and their mother has a large language model, right? Including the CIA and the IRS, right? So that's if you saw the presidential order on AI, what Biden actually did was ensure that the federal government had their own models, for everything. So that included Google, Meta, right? So all of these. So Google was caught off guard by the whole generative AI thing because they were king of search, and they had YouTube, they had Gmail, they have all of this, that they have Google Classroom. So they were scrambling to catch up with Bard. So they had to dump billions into training billions of parameters to do that. But the new Google Gemini Advanced, or 1.5 as it's known in the community as well, we were just playing with it. The controversy is, and this is something you need to be discussing with your students. How many guardrails do we need, and when does it become censorship, and when can we have honest conversations about things and challenging questions? So for instance, ChatGPT has guardrails to where it won't tell dirty jokes, it won't say anything inappropriate. You can say, give me a lewd joke about a woman. It said, I can't do that, right? So so in the same way, they kind of counter-corrected to, use, gender pronouns, right? Once again, be accepting, be inclusive, be accessible. So all those guardrails are in there, but in this case, it led to Gemini outputting what they told it was be representational when it comes to images of humans. And that means that whatever it outputs, it has to also cycle through Asian, African American, right? So Hispanic, etc. So it was outputting African American Nazi soldiers, right? So if you saw that, yeah. And so it was doing what it told them to do, which was to be inclusive, but yeah, they got in trouble for that. So they pulled it in that way. But this leads to the question is, how many guardrails do we want? So for instance, who teaches literature here? We don't have any lit professors? We got one. Oh, you're all alone. I'm sorry. Okay. So for instance, if you were using, literature professors loved Claude, which is from Anthropic. And Claude did a great job of summarizing large PDFs that you uploaded it, and you could ask it questions about stories, etc. It had an update 2 weeks ago, which stated it would not discuss violent content, which any literature professor will tell you cuts out 90% of all literature. So no Hamlet, no Shakespeare, no nothing. So then, that's kind of the question is, guardrails, censorship, keeping people safe. It won't generate, for instance, violent or disturbing imagery unless you jailbreak it or trick it into doing so for DALL-E. That's why DALL-E for OpenAI is also not in the same lawsuit as Stable Diffusion. So you can't say, give me the opening scene to Saving Private Ryan where the guy has his guts blown out, and is screaming for his mommy. It won't do it, right? So it won't do anything violent. So good, bad, I mean, it depends upon, what we're using it for. So that's the kind of questions you want to challenge your students with. That being, is this good? Is this bad? Is it okay to completely have everything PG rated? Is life PG rated? So, you can, how do you have those tough discussions, about what life is really like? So that's an easy way in. So have them, I dare you to go on, DALL-E right now up here, and then give me an image of someone shooting someone. Won't do it, right? So, and then have a conversation about gun violence, right? So, there's lots of ways you can have it in here. Other questions? That was easy. Okay. Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me. We have tons and tons of resources. We'll try to keep it brief as far as, what will actually help you, because there's way too much out there. If anyone tells you have to get certifications in something or you're falling behind because of AI, they're fear-mongering. Don't listen to them, right? It's really easy to get caught up. Thank you.
Thank you.